Welcome, everyone. My name is Suzanne Morse-Mumma, and I'm the director of the University of Virginia Press. We're delighted to have you here. We want to get right to our program, so let me introduce our speakers tonight. Let me begin with Peter Eisenstadt, who is our author. Peter is a leading expert in the work of Howard Thurman. And his book, which we will discuss tonight, Against the Hounds of Hell, A Life of Howard Thurman, is a delight. So I'm looking forward to hearing Peter's answers to questions from all of you. He is associate editor of the Howard Thurman Papers Project and an affiliate member of the Clemson University Department of History. He is the author of a number of books, including Rockdale Village, Robert Moses, 6,000 Families, and New York City's Great Experiment in Integrated Housing. His book is part of the American South series at the press. Joining him and us is Professor Kevin Gaines, who is the inaugural professor, Julian Bond Professor of Civil Rights and Social Justice at the University of Virginia. He comes to Virginia directly from Cornell University, but has taught at a number of other places. He holds an appointment, a joint appointment in the Carter G. Woodson Institute of African American and African Studies and the Corcoran Department of History. He's the author of Uplifting the Race, Black Leadership, Politics, and Culture During the 20th Century, that won the John Hope Franklin Prize. So we're delighted to have both with us tonight. And I think I will turn to you, Professor Gaines, to get us started.
Thank you, Suzanne, for that wonderful introduction. And thanks to everyone who's joining us. And we look forward to your questions later on. So Peter, I want to congratulate you on this book. It's just a wonderful book, a wonderful contribution. I consider it a gift for my research on the civil rights movement and its sort of intellectual roots and origins. And I just wanted to begin by asking you, what was your introduction to Howard Thurman? And why did you decide to write this biography? And maybe also if you could just, sort of briefly talk about his significance. What was his impact on American religion? And I think we're also, I think many of the people tuning in know about his connection to the civil rights movement, and we'll certainly be talking about that. But if you could just briefly describe his impact on the civil rights movement.
Well, first, Kevin, thank you for the very kind words about my book. It's much appreciated. How did I get involved in Howard Thurman? Without making this too much about myself, I was, after I completed my doctorate, I was working as a historical reference editor. I edited several encyclopedias. I heard about this job as an associate for the Howard Thurman Papers Project. I applied, I got the job. I knew very little about Thurman. I had done some work in African American history. And it began as a job and it's become a mission, and this was over a quarter century ago that I started working on Howard Thurman. And I worked on other projects along the way. With Walter R. Fluker as a senior editor, I was the associate editor for 5 volumes of the Howard Thurman Papers Project, which I think has been the turning point in the study of Howard Thurman. And, it's sort of like, I figured who else would a better place to write a biography than me. I had done a lot of the work. And I think my book is only one of the recent books that have come out or are coming out about Thurman. There's been a renaissance of scholarship about Thurman. And, that's why I mean, the 5 volumes are not something people are going to read, and I wanted to write a book that people would actually read, and I tried to make it as readable and as possible. Thurman's significance. I think he is one of the underrated shapers of mid-20th century America. I think, as you said, his relation to the civil rights movement is sort of known, but I think the way things go, he's sort of like a harbinger of Martin Luther King, and not really seen for his own, for his own contributions. And I think he is one of the major shapers of 20th century American religion. I think if more and more people say that they're spiritual and not religious and not going to church regularly, but they have some sort of connection to God, Thurman was definitely one of the people in mid-20th century America who shaped this. And I think, more generally, I think he was one of a number of Black intellectuals who reshaped the meaning of American democracy in the middle decades of the 20th century. And I think his role and other people's roles have really not been fully examined. And I hope my book leads to people picking up his work again and understanding his place in American history, in African-American history and American history.
Yeah, I agree that he's a very important intellectual of the 20th century, Black intellectual, and I certainly agree with your point about maybe it's Howard Thurman we can look to for this broader interest in spirituality that transcends a given a particular religious faith. So this book is so well written, and you begin with this extraordinary scene. Howard Thurman's meeting with the world famous Mahatma Gandhi in India in 1935. And tell us about that meeting. What did Gandhi tell Thurman? You mentioned that Thurman has this connection to the nonviolent, direct action strategy of the civil rights movement. But this is a really pivotal meeting that you begin with.
Right. Well, I just, I didn't want to begin the biography with he was born, that it's a strategy. And I decided to various reasons, to start with the most famous episode in his life. He was part of a 4-person delegation. It was the Negro delegation, as they called it, on the pilgrimage of friendship to India, which in 1935-36 included Pakistan, Bangladesh, and he visited what's now Sri Lanka and Myanmar as well. And they traveled the length and depth of British India for about 4 or 5 months. And the highlight was a meeting with Gandhi. And they were the first African Americans to meet with Gandhi. And Gandhi had already been praised in Black newspapers as the greatest colored man in the world and stuff like that. So he was a well-known figure in America. And Thurman had been a pacifist from the early 1920s. So it's not like he was converted. I think his time in India was more confirmational than transformational. I think it affirmed all of his beliefs. He wrote after he came back, he did not know what it was like to hate before he went to India, which is an extraordinary statement for somebody born in Florida and grew up in the worst of Jim Crow Florida in the early 20th century. I think his time in India was almost like a platonic idea of white supremacy. It was 30,000 British people kept 300 million people under their boot. It was a tiny, tiny number of people were controlling India. And I think he was an honorary white person while he was there because he was treated as a Westerner, and to the extent that there was a division between native peoples and Westerners, he was given all of the accolades that Westerners were given. It was his first time in a non-Western country. He saw the weakness of Christianity. When he was in India, a number of people came up to him and said, "What are you doing? You know, you seem intelligent, but you know you're just presenting the religion of the oppressor. And how could an intelligent Black person really be a Christian?" And I think he was challenged by India in a way he never had been before. And he gave, we could talk about this, the way he understood this. And then towards the end of the trip, he met with Gandhi. And it was a remarkable meeting, lasting for a few hours. And Gandhi asked them questions. The three people who met with Gandhi were Thurman, his wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, and one other man. And they asked Gandhi's questions. And at the end of the meeting, and they wanted Gandhi to come to the United States. And he says, "No, I have to work here with India." And Gandhi said, and Thurman, others pledged that they would, hold up the tradition of nonviolence. And Gandhi said to him, "If it comes true, it may be through the Negroes that the unadulterated message of nonviolence would be delivered to the world." And it became a phrase during the civil rights movement that, it was, one of the beginnings of a radical African-American understanding of nonviolence, and Gandhi had given sort of the benediction to the movement.
Yes, absolutely. And in the late 30s and early 40s, you start to see discussions in the African-American press, speculating whether a Negro Gandhi might emerge. I believe that was W.E.B. Du Bois, who was talking about the possibility of nonviolence for, a mass movement in the near future.
Right,
So,
and there were articles in the press, and I think an article in the Pittsburgh Courier in 42 where Thurman was held out as a possible leader of the great Gandhian movement. He wasn't temperamentally suited to that sort of role. I think he was too introverted, and I think he wasn't a tactician, a strategist of that sort. But certainly by the late 30s, early 40s, he was seen as one of the real potential leaders of a Gandhian movement. And he had already, through people like his student at Howard, James Farmer, who founded CORE, Pauli Murray, who was close to him, had done other things. He already was beginning by the early 40s to mentor people who were beginning, the process of radical nonviolence and segregation.
Yeah, you started to talk a little bit about his upbringing, his beginnings in segregated Florida at the start of the 20th century. Could you say a little bit more about his childhood, upbringing, and the family members that had the biggest impact on it?
Well, he was raised in Daytona. As he was born in 1899, as Jim Crow was beginning to tighten in Florida. He was largely raised by women. His stepfather died when he was 9. Thurman never wrote anywhere that his stepfather was not his biological father, and he was quiet about the fact that his real father was somebody that was known, and he was teased about it evidently when he was growing up. And I think it contributed to a sense of isolation and alienation that he had when he was growing up. The biggest influence on his life was his grandmother, Nancy Ambrose, who was born into slavery in North Florida around 1844. And I think she was a very strong woman who sort of imprinted on him sort of his Afro-syncretic Christian worldview to some extent, and a certain personal toughness and sweetness at the same time. His mother, Alice Ambrose, was more retiring. He was, I think, worried early about his masculinity because he grew up with a household of women and sisters. One of the biggest influence, though, on his life growing up was Mary McLeod Bethune, who had founded what became Bethune-Cookman College in Daytona. And, you know, he was very bright. He was lucky. He was able to get a good education, went to Morehouse College, and then on to Rochester Theological Seminary for his training, and that's his life. Let me, if I can, let me show just a few images of Thurman. Let's see if this works. This is Thurman around 1965. This is his grandmother, Nancy Ambrose. This is his mother, Alice Ambrose. This is Thurman's yearbook picture when he graduated from Morehouse in 1923, surrounded by a ton of accolades and every award that he had won. This is Sue Bailey Thurman meeting Gandhi in early 1936. This is Howard and Sue and some Howard University undergraduates around 1940. Here is his family in the late 40s with his daughter Olive on the left and daughter Anne on the right. And this is Thurman late in life, sitting on a desk, laughing at one of his own jokes with his hands together, and Thurman the sage. And that's just give you a brief sense of what he looks like.
Thank you for sharing those Peter.
Kevin, excuse me, just 1 second. We had a request that Peter would sit back in his chair. People want to see your full face. Well,
yes, seeing my balding head probably is not the best look.
Thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt.
So Peter, let's get into this really complicated question of Thurman's religious faith, which was deeply personal, and as I said, a really complicated question. A lot of people who have written about Thurman have described him as a mystic. And, you know, Thurman's first pastorate was in a Black Baptist church in Oberlin, but Thurman really seemed uncomfortable identifying as a Christian. And this goes back to how he was challenged as a Black man who, claimed to be a Christian in India, that, and I think Thurman really sort of understood that kind of critique or criticism. Thurman understood that organized U.S. Christianity was complicit in, slavery and racism and segregation, and that globally Christianity had sided with, the oppressors over the oppressed. And so, Thurman understood this, And so I think he was trying to find a religious identity that was something other than what we might expect as, someone who was professing to Christianity. You argue that Thurman addressed the problem of Black survival. That seemed to be at the core of his theology. And he did lots of preaching and writing on the religion of Jesus. And that seemed to be the core of his religious faith. So tell us about Thurman's focus on the religion of Jesus. And maybe this is where you can sort of explain the title of your book too, the Hounds of Hell, which definitely needs some unpacking.
Some big questions there. Thurman, I think his primary religious connection was as a nature mystic. He found God out of doors, and God was connected to everything that was alive. And he found this very early and was, God intoxicated from his youth. He also, was initiated and baptized in the Black church. And I think he found a sense of community that he did not find elsewhere. And I think he very much, loved his upbringing in the Black church. I think he always considered himself a Christian. I think, one story he often told was when his stepfather, Saul Solomon Thurman, died around 1909. And his stepfather was not a believer, not a Christian, that his church didn't want to have a service for him because he died out of Christ. So they found a preacher who would conduct the service, but he said, he's now in hell because he's not a believer, and that and Thurman said, I'll never be a member of a church again. And I think he reacted against the narrowness and what he saw the parochial nature of a lot of evangelical Black Christianity. And when he went to Rochester Theological Seminary, I think he got a firmer understanding of that. When he studied with Rufus Jones at Haverford College, despite the fact Haverford College did not have any Black students, he and Rufus Jones was one of the foremost students of American mysticism. I think he got a name to, he understood the mystic tradition implicitly after he studied with Jones. It was a knowledge of the mystical tradition. And Black survival was absolutely key to what he did. He saw his religion, as opposed to a lot of Black Christians, was not Jesus-centered. It was centered on God. And he would say this often, that he worshiped God, he really didn't worship Jesus. And he saw Jesus as the human being. He said that Jesus was, in his best known book, Jesus and the Disinherited, Jesus was a Jew, he was a poor Jew, he was not a citizen. And those three things were key, and he saw this as very similar to the situation of African Americans. And for Thurman, Jesus' life was how you survive as somebody who is not a citizen. And he argued for a number of years, culminating in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, that the problems that faced the disinherited, people who had their back against the wall, as he said, was precisely the fact that they had no security, that they tended to be could be paralyzed by fear, that they lived lives of deception, that they couldn't tell the truth to other people and to themselves. And they tended to be controlled by, controlled by hate, which he saw as a destructive emotion that, sort of burned people up and didn't accomplish anything. And he described those as the hounds of hell. And the way of survival for a disinherited person or people is to overcome these and to live a life without fear, to live an honest life, and you tell people how you feel. And you can be angry and you have to like address wrongs, but hatred he found was destructive. He had wanted to call the book The Religion of Jesus and the Disinherited. And the religion of Jesus for Thurman was different than Christianity. They didn't want to publish it with that title, and they were arguing about it. And he suggested that you call the book The Hounds of Hell. And they said, this sounds like a Sherlock Holmes novel, we're not going to do it. But I sort of think The Hounds of Hell would be, Jesus and Disinherited is a good title, but I think The Hounds of Hell would have been a better title. So sort of honoring Thurman's suggestion, I called my book Against the Hounds of Hell. And I do think it is really what his life was dedicated to helping all people, particularly disinherited people, to find the inner spiritual strength to overcome fear, to overcome deception, and overcome hatred. And he saw the civil rights movement as a culmination of this. As he would write, millions of Black people in the South had overcome their fears, were no longer afraid to say what was on their mind. The challenge was with hatred. And this is one of the stories of the civil rights movement of the 60s. But I think he was an inspiration to a lot of people. Martin Luther King was one of the first readers of Jesus and Disinherited. This we know because of his unfortunate habit of plagiarizing books, and he plagiarized it a few months after it was published. And they said, people have, early biographers said that it was one of his favorite books. We could talk a little more about its relation with King. I don't know if I've answered your question, Kevin, but I think it's, and I think his version of religion was all about people gathering, finding the inner strength they needed to deal with these crises, to find how to dedicate your life to a cause that was crucial. And I think this was his contribution to the civil rights movement, is to give people this sort of insight that, the revolution will start with you. You have to overcome these problems if you want to deal with, you have to overcome the hounds of hell if you want to deal with this as, take on the challenges that you face as exploited and disinherited peoples.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like he was giving the coming civil rights movement a blueprint for the struggle, to conquer fear, to conquer the fear of almost inevitable violence under Jim Crow, to strip away all the illusions that African Americans were confronted with and the nation was confronted with on racism, and to try to transcend hatred, to not adopt the hatred of the oppressor. And I think those lessons were really central among the nonviolent activists in the movement. You mentioned King as one of the initial readers of Jesus and the Disinherited. And King how did King encounter Thurman? I mean, I think they went back a long way. There's a relationship there. It's not that King is picking up Thurman's book and just and learning about him then. If you could just talk about their relationship, I think that would be really helpful.
Well, Martin Luther King Sr. was a student at Morehouse College. He was an older student when Thurman was teaching there around 1928, 1932. Sue Bailey Thurman, who married Thurman in 1932, was his second wife, his first wife died, had been a roommate of Alberta Mayo, who married King. So their connections go way back. There's a story that when he got back from India and went to Atlanta for the first time, shortly after he got back, I think he's thinking Morehouse, he had dinner with the Kings. And 7-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. was at the table and was listening to stories. So, you know, almost in the beginning of King's life, he knew who Thurman was. There's a couple of times they were together in the 40s. They were never that close. So at that time, they overlapped at Boston University. And Thurman came to Boston University as a professor of spiritual resources and discipline and as Dean of Chapel in 1953. And King was there as a student. And King had finished his coursework, but they knew each other. They watched the World Series together in 1953. There's an interesting and odd letter in December 1954. The president of Dillard University, New Orleans, who was a classmate of Thurman at Morehouse, was looking for new dean of chapel. And he said, you know, I've heard good things about this Martin Luther King Jr. as a preacher. What do you think about him as dean of chapel? And he says, well, you know, King is okay, but he's sort of young, and maybe you should, you know, and then he suggested somebody else for the job. And so when I saw this letter, I said, oh, this changed the course of history, because if King hadn't been in Montgomery in December of 1953, it would have been different. Actually, King was already working at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. But I think it shows that for Thurman and maybe for King, there were qualities that were not yet clear in King, that I think he just seemed like a middle class, relatively, things had come easy to him. And I think it was only afterwards that I think King grew into the man he was when he had the challenge of the Montgomery boycott and what came after. So I think they were never close. And they met a few times afterwards, after that assassination attempt against King in 1959, where he almost died. Thurman had a vision of King. He went down and saw him and told him, Thurman liked to speak behind the scenes to people. He really did not like being out in front. That's one reason why he's not as well known as he was. He says, you know, you can't let this movement overwhelm you. After he was convalescing from his injury, he decided to go to India, sort of in Thurman's footsteps. And the next few months were was the quietest period in King's adult life. And I think he took King's advice to stay quiet. But, you know, I think, you know, there's a big debate among historians about who are the influences on King and how did King get to be the person he was. For various reasons, I think King tended to downplay the African-American intellectuals who shaped him, and he's focused more on Niebuhr and people like that because these were the people, when he was speaking to white America, who they would have been more familiar with. But I think Jesus and Disinherited was King's first real exposure to radical nonviolence. And it certainly was a key book for him.
Well, it must have been because, you know, King was freely quoting from the book and sampling some of its passages. Peter, we actually have some questions coming in, and I want to turn to Nadine to pose one of the questions from our audience.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I'm Nadine Zimmerli. I'm the editor for history at UVA Press, and it was my great delight to work with Peter Eisenstadt on this book. He is a dream author, and it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And the first question that came in actually relates back to Howard Thurman's religious beliefs. Could you share Thurman's reflections on Judaism and how his attitudes imbued his own religious beliefs?
Well, first, let me see Nadine with a dream editor. So compliments are fine. Judaism was very important to Thurman. As I said, if you read Jesus Disinherited, he starts off by saying, emphasizing his Judaism and that his sense of Judaism in first century Palestine as being a religion that was concerned with oppression under Roman domination. He says at one point that the Jews in Palestine were not slaves, but they were not free. Once again, like the situation of Black Americans in the mid-20th century. As I said before, his Christianity did not emphasize Jesus, and he found something very reassuring in Judaism, in that it was a religion that emphasized the unity of God and the oneness of God and didn't have intermediaries. He felt the same way about Islam, and you see some very interesting things he had to say about Islam when he was in India. But you know, in America, in the middle decades of the 20th century, Judaism was the largest non-Christian religion there, and he had ongoing contacts with a number of rabbis who he influenced. One of his disciples was a man named Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who was from a Hasidic background, and he became and is one of the founders of a new Jewish spirituality, neo-Hasidic spirituality in the second half of the 20th century. And Zalman Schachter Shalomi often called Thurman his Black Rebbe. And I think on Judaism and in Christianity, he emphasized a religion, an experiential religion of experiencing the divine directly. I think Judaism was important for him, and I think he shaped the course of 20th century American Judaism as well.
Thank you for that question. And another really great question has come in that really sort of speaks to, I think, Thurman's interest in forging connections with different faiths, people from different backgrounds, different faith traditions. And the question is from Greg Robinson. And I will just read it. How did Thurman's experience leading an interracial and also interfaith church in San Francisco and working with Asian Americans influenced his development. Of course, the question refers to the fellowship church that Thurman founded in 1944 as this experiment in an integrated and interfaith church. And Peter, that's a big part of Thurman's story, and I think I should let you tell it.
Well, when he was in India, he had an epiphany at the Khyber Pass, which was the passage between Afghanistan and what's now Pakistan. That when he returned to the United States, he had to form a church that was interracial and interdenominational. And it took him about a decade until this came about. And I don't think we have time to tell the full story. It was at wartime, and but finally in 1944, he left a very comfortable position as Dean of Chapel, Howard University, certainly one of the most prestigious religious positions in Black America, to co-pastor, and pretty soon he was the chief pastor of a small fledgling interracial church in San Francisco, the Fellowship Church of All Peoples, and he led that from 1944 to 1953. The Asian American part of the story is very interesting as well. On the West Coast, the Great Migration really took place during World War II rather than after World War I, because of the opening of so many defense industry jobs in the San Francisco Bay Area. And of course, in 1942, there was a Japanese internment and expulsion. And in a number of West Coast cities, the Black neighborhood grew up, developed in the former areas where the Japanese had lived. They already were sort of seen as a place where non-whites would live. And San Francisco was no exception. And the Japanese neighborhood very rapidly became the area that had the largest concentration of Blacks. The first home of the Fellowship Church was in the former Japanese Presbyterian Church. Thurman, even before that, in 42, 43, had visited several internment centers on the West Coast on various trips. And starting in 45, when Japanese were let out of the camps, 44, 45, a number of Japanese Americans joined the Fellowship Church. One of the most moving stories that Thurman tells, that when in the summer of 45, when Nagasaki was bombed, the atomic bomb, that the church secretary was from Nagasaki, and Thurman held her hand, he says, from like 8 o'clock in the morning to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and did not say a word. So one of the things that was important about in San Francisco for Thurman was getting beyond the Black-white dyad, that recognizing that America was a multiracial society, and that and he was proud of the fact that the church had Filipinos, Chinese, Japanese, Native Americans, that it was truly a church for all peoples. And it was, and I think he was a pioneer in seeing that that the church couldn't, that the future of American race relations would not just be a Black-white story.
You mentioned how his church attracted people from all these different backgrounds and even faiths. Could you talk a little bit about what was so extraordinary about Howard Thurman's presence in the pulpit? I mean, it's kind of like trying to sort of describe music or someone like John Coltrane, a great improviser. But if you could just say a little bit about that.
Well, as with John Coltrane, the best thing to do is to listen to him rather than talk about him. And I would recommend if anybody's interested in Thurman, they should go to Boston University as a virtual listening room that has hundreds of his sermons available. And I think listening to a few of his sermons is a way to understand him. He was very unlike sort of standard, the stereotype of a Black preacher thumping the pulpit with rhythmic cadences. This was not the way that he gave a sermon, but he was a master. He was a master of theater. He would raise his voice, lower his voice. He would, it's hard to describe. He did not like preaching. He didn't like preaching to people. He did not like telling people what to do and what to believe. In his sermons, the focus invariably was to get people to look in themselves, to look at their inner resources, to understand them, themselves. This was what he wanted people to try to do, and invariably his sermons were about that, about the need for personal reflection, to not live on the outside of things, to discover your the depths to your soul and your personality that you had. And I think he taught the same way, with encouraging people to find their own answers to questions. He was very Socratic, I think, in the way he approached that. But as you said, Kevin, the best thing to do is to listen to him. I think he was afraid for many years that his words on the page fell flat. And I think it's one reason why he didn't publish his first book until he was in his mid-40s. And you do miss something when you're just reading his words. But he did publish in the end of 20 books, and so he developed that as well. But I think he always thought the medium he was best at was preaching. And as I said, I mean, people should listen to him.
Thank you, Peter. Nadine has an excellent question from the audience about Thurman's wife, who was quite a formidable figure in her own right. Nadine?
Yeah, and everybody, please keep the questions coming. You can type them into the chat or the Q&A feature. So, Peter, could you speak to the nature of the relationship between Howard Thurman and Sue Bailey Thurman? Was theirs an equal partnership?
It was. If there's one regret I have for the book, is I don't have as much about Sue Bailey Thurman as I would like. And I think the reason for that is when Sue was giving the papers to Boston University, she did not give the personal papers of Howard Thurman and herself too. I think both of them wanted their privacy, and I wish I could have done more. I hope somebody that does write a good biography of her and find the sources to do it. she was his second wife. His first wife, Katie Kelly, died of tuberculosis in 1930. When Thurman married Sue Bailey, she was a national secretary for the YWCA. She was probably better known than he was. And they had a remarkable marriage. And I think they supported each other. Thurman was the introvert. Sue Bailey was the extrovert and drew people into their circle. The place where I think you get a sense of her personality most is in the famous meeting with Gandhi, that everybody was respectful of Gandhi. And Sue kept on asking difficult questions. She asked Gandhi, how come when he was in South Africa, he was for 20 years, you didn't involve Native Africans in your Satyagraha struggles? And I think Gandhi gave a weak defense of a very dubious policy on the part of Gandhi. And I think it contributed ultimately to the failure of what he was doing with Indians. And then there was a place where Thurman and Gandhi were getting into this sort of airy metaphysical discussion about nonviolence and what is it, and it's a force in the universe and blah, blah, blah. And he said, okay, that's fine, but what should I do if my brother is lynched? How do I deal with nonviolence on a practical way? And I think for me that epitomizes what Sue Bailey was, that she was more down to earth. She was a vehement opponent of imperialism and racism, as you can see from her writings after India and to some extent in 1945. And I think, you know, they're both opposites and sympathetic in various ways. You know, she's a remarkable person, and there's more of her story to tell.
Well, yes, absolutely, absolutely. Hopefully, those letters still exist somewhere. We have a few more minutes and a lot more to cover, and we talked a little bit about Thurman's relationship to the civil rights movement. And I think that's a complex issue. When Thurman wrote his autobiography in 1979, some of the reviewers sort of asked this question and, you know, kind of put Thurman on the defensive. Well, why weren't you marching? Why aren't you in all those photos of the civil rights leaders linked arm in arm, you know, on the front lines? And Thurman actually had a very complicated relationship to the Black Power movement and Black nationalism. After the sort of the high tide of the civil rights movement, could you talk about those years for Thurman and this perception of him as not being part of the movement, even though he had been this incredible sort of spiritual mentor for so many leaders like King and James Farmer and Reverend James Lawson, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, it certainly would have been easier for his future biographers if he had attended a few of the civil rights demonstrations, and you wouldn't have to like come up with, when it amounts to excuses. You know, I talked about it in the book, but I think in the end he was somebody who didn't want to steal the spotlight from people. I think he felt he was contributing to the movement as he had done for many years by speaking to people behind the scenes. He never saw himself as a political leader. And, you know, I think it draws on things that are deep in his psychology, why he did not participate. He went to the March on Washington. He was happy to be an anonymous person in the crowd. By every right, he should have been one of the people who was up on the dais speaking.
And And Sue also.
And Sue too, yes. You know, and as you know, no women spoke at the March on Washington, but that's another story. His relation with Black Power is really interesting. In The Search for Common Ground, he definitely condemns it. He writes angrily about being called Uncle Tom, about being criticized for his dress, that his generation was being criticized for being, Stan Paddish and not, being militant enough. But at the same time, he was very close friends and had deep admirers, people like Lerone Bennett, who was one of the popularizers of the term of Black Power, Vincent Harding, who at the time had broken decisively with King and was writing that integration was passé. Derek Bell, who was a fierce critic of integration, was somebody wrote me last week. Derek Bell was a legal theorist and said that he was a student of Derek Bell and he invited Derek Bell to his wedding. Derek Bell couldn't make it, so as a wedding present, he sent him a copy of Thurman's autobiography. I think it's easy to pigeonhole Black intellectuals and Black political figures as integrationist, nationalist, and I think sometimes the distinctions are made too fine. I think people saw in Thurman somebody who understood the tragedy of Black existence in America. He did not minimize it. He understood suffering. At the same time, he resolutely refused to pathologize it. He used psychological categories, but he was not an example of what has been called the damaged psyche theory of Black oppression, which is to say that he always saw, and this I think is deeply involved in his religious views, that Black people have the capacity to overcome their psychological stigma, once again, the fear, the depression, the hatred by themselves, and they would have to do it by themselves. Jesus Disinherited was addressed to Black America. It was not addressed to white America. And I think his ability to write about the capacities of, of Black America to overcome their oppression, I think appealed to a lot of people. And if they disagreed on tactics, they agreed more broadly. The one thing Thurman hated more than anything else was separatism. He did not think that it made sense for Black Americans to separate themselves off from white Americans. He saw that as a delusion and something that was a failure. But I think he tried very hard and had a fair amount of success in transcending the gap between some of his views and the views in the 60s. And I think, he was his work on Jesus Disinherited was an influential work of history. And I think historians like Lerone Bennett, who wrote Before the Mayflower, probably the best known popular history of Black Americans during the Civil Rights Movement, Vincent Harding, and Nathan Huggins appreciated that Thurman, in some ways, was a historian and had a historical message to tell. I think looking at Thurman in his last decade of his life is one of the most interesting parts of his stories, and he continued to reach out to a Black America that had changed, from where it had been before. That's sort of an answer to that.
Well, Peter, we're really at the end of our time, and thank you so much for this book. When I was reading the section of your discussion on Jesus and the Disinherited, I was really thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement. I was really thinking about the challenges that African Americans face today in confronting, systemic racism, and so I just think our discussion today sort of scratches the surface. And I highly recommend the book. It's beautifully written, eloquently told, and thank you, Peter, for taking and investing the enormous time and effort of producing a biography. I have the utmost admiration for biographers. So thank you all for attending, and thank you for your questions. We have some time left. I guess. My watch is not in sync with yours. Let's hear from these questions from the Q&A. Nadine?
Yeah, so there's two that I think you can answer fairly quickly. The first one is, did Howard Thurman ever cross paths with Thomas Merton, a fellow mystic? They had the sort of same, as the question goes, passion for social justice. And the second is, could you speak briefly to Thurman's visit to Israel?
The answer to the first question is no. As far as I know, he did not meet Thomas Merton. As far as I know, he never wrote about Thomas Merton in his writings. I'm not sure why. He did not he visited Israel in 1963 after his stay in Africa, his really only extended time in Africa in the fall of '63. And I think he was somewhat taken aback by his time in Israel. I think he did not find it connected to the religion of the prophets. I think he was found Israel at once too secular and too religious at the same time, sort of the ultra-Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem. As it happened, I have just completed an article about Thurman's time in Israel. And I don't know who asked this question, but if anybody is interested, I mean, I talk about it in the book, but if somebody is interested in that in specific about his time in Israel, please send me an email. I'd be happy to send you a copy of what I've written about that.
Well, I just want to thank you all for being here, and to thank my colleagues Nadine and Emily, but a particular thanks to Professor Kevin Gaines and to our author, Professor Peter Eisenstadt. I would just echo Kevin's words. This book is a joy to read. It's an honor from UVA Press to have you among our authors. So thank you all. Have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Kevin, Nadine, and Emily, and Suzanne.